So, in the spirit of all that we intend to share with you this evening, we'll start with opening words to model something of the pattern that we hope you will consider in your campaigns. We can understand the abundance of the universe in two ways: as an invitation to complacency or as an invitation to generosity. It is when we respond to the abundance of life with gratitude and generosity that we become a part of that universal creativity. Opening words from our minister, the Reverend Dr. Kendall Gibbons, who now is serving in Kansas City. So I'd like to start our time with a little bit of an understanding of stewardship and why we have embraced that more in the last few years than we were perhaps using as much as 10 years ago. We talked less about stewardship and more about the canvas and capital campaigns and things. But stewardship is truly what we are investing ourselves in, and it is most accurately defined as the careful, responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. So this is much broader than an annual budget campaign, much broader actually than even a capital campaign that might be securing future buildings and such. You can imagine that stewardship also holds the responsibility for the care of the vulnerable among us, children, aging, those who suffer from other struggles in their lives. It's also about maintaining our good reputations. I mean, stewardship is a part of our entire gathered community of faith. Our life together is all about stewardship. So we encourage you to keep a very broad perspective on our enterprise of sustaining the mission of our congregations.
So, as Nancy said, stewardship is very broad, and I have a diagram here of the stewardship ministry engine. So, stewardship is not just limited to money, as you know, and it's really linked to your mission and deeper fellowship. So, you can make spiritual connections through your stewardship work, and that leads to more generous stewardship, more generous financial giving, but more generous stewardship with time and talent as well. And when you use your community giving, fair share giving guide, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the webinar, that can help with generous stewardship as well. And these face-to-face stewardship congregations, although doing those every year is not really feasible, they're an important component of stewardship, so that you can check in with folks periodically. If you do that model every 3 years, or in particular, if you are going to run a capital campaign, those are essential. Having one-on-one conversations, and again, about much more than money. Nancy will talk a little bit later and have a slide about what those stewardship conversations look like, but the money piece of it is actually the much smaller piece of it, and the bigger piece is really sharing and connecting and getting to know each other. And when you do that well, then usually you can fund more of your mission with the generous stewardship that results, and then you can have a more ministry-based focus, which helps you have deeper fellowship, which in turn then puts you back around the circle with your spiritual connection. So it's all linked together, and again, stewardship is much broader than just money. And when you do have a broad stewardship model, and I know one of the congregations, Boise, said that they want to talk a little bit about year-round stewardship. This is part of it. There's so much to stewardship rather than just the annual budget drive, and so we want you to think about that in the broader context. So connection and community is really a very key piece of successful stewardship. And having a spiritual connection and an emotional connection and an intellectual connection and a financial connection, those are all 4 aspects of successful stewardship. So the most successful stewardship campaigns really strengthen connection and community. Because again, the more connected people feel, the more community they feel with their congregation, the more time they're going to give to the congregation, the more talent that they're going to give to the congregation, and the more treasure that they're going to give to the congregation. And then thinking back to our slide that we just looked at, that's going to let you fund more of your mission and vision. And again, then also leads to deeper fellowship with one another. So these components are all equally important. I know I have financial there at the bottom, doesn't mean that that's the least important, but they all are really very important. And when we think about the different reasons people give, we're a diverse community, and some people give as an expression of compassion. Some people give as a connection to their community. And sometimes leaders give because they feel it's their responsibility, and that it's logical because they know the details of the budget. So connection and community are just four pieces that really touch upon the whole successful stewardship model. So speaking of inspiring and tending generosity, I have a quote here by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Kind hearts are the garden, kind thoughts are the roots, kind words are the flowers, kind deeds are the fruits. Take care of your garden and keep out the weeds, fill it with sunshine, kind words, and kind deeds. So kindness and generosity are inextricably linked. And again, generosity is not limited to just money. It's generous praise and thanks, generous listening, generous assumption of good faith, all sorts of ways we can be generous that don't involve money. But doing things in a kind way is a way to inspire more generosity of all kinds. So for your annual campaign, just like any other type of thing that you're running at your congregation, you will need people to be generous with their time and their talent and their treasure. So making sure that you're inspiring and tending generosity through kindness is an important piece of that.
So in some sense, we have thus far been recapping for you very, very briefly the two previous webinars in this series, one on generosity and one on beloved community, as each of those inform stewardship in a congregation. So we'll now shift to what we promised for tonight, which is framing your annual campaign. I imagine that all of you are in the beginning stages. Some of you may be ready to launch as early as in February, and so we may be your boosters here to just get you over this final hump before you launch your campaign. Most important to focus on the positive, to allow people to recognize that while no community is perfect, no human being is perfect, that we are together to reinforce the positive of community, to find a common good between and among us, to actually be prepared to kind of give up some of our rugged individualism in service to a common good that we value. So we would want to emphasize very clearly in language and image and tone that abundance over a sense of scarcity. Sometimes those who are most intimate with our campaigns have a lot of information, and they may know that there's a particular scarcity, but abundance will get you closer to what you seek than any kind of panic. So also we want to emphasize generosity over a sense of obligation. There is an obligation in communal life to be supportive of that community, but that is less effective in promoting generosity among all kinds of giving. We want to emphasize what people receive for their gifts, not necessarily what they're paying for. So we give in support of this community because we believe in its mission, because we know that the church is a worthy organization. We trust that our generosity will support the mission and will be well managed and well accounted for, and that our congregations know how to be responsible with our financial resources. So this is a positive focus of a campaign. We also want to focus on programs over salaries, or programs over the expense line item that you will actually spend the money on. We'll have a bit more to say about that in just a moment. But again, I would say that the mission is what we seek to serve, rather than the need to fill the furnace with heating oil or something like that. That we want to fund the good works of the congregation, the needs that are met by the congregation, rather than those expense line items that we need to pay for in order to serve the mission. So there's an opportunity here to highlight the past, to pull forward that inspiring narrative in your congregation that emphasizes what you have done well in the past, to bring it into the present and share those kinds of accomplishments. I think that you'll recognize that any of you who receive, and I'm not sure any among us don't receive, fundraising materials from other worthy organizations. Sometimes it's organizations in the arts, sometimes it's social concerns, or food banks and the symphony and the art museum and animal protection, the environment. There are many things that we're all interested in, and we are solicited to financially support those as well. I encourage you, even in your committee, to kind of bring in some of the materials that you have received from other organizations, and to recognize how they focus on their accomplishments, on what they have achieved in the past year or years, on what they use your money for, to accomplish in terms of mission, not exactly how they spend your money. So that's I think an important shift. So so we want to move very specifically from scarcity into abundance. So that there is no inspiration in a panicky approach. Even if you need to do a really good canvas this year for some particular reason, perhaps last year's was disappointing, even if that is the case, you will succeed far more with a positive approach, with a focus on what is going well, with a focus on what you are all doing together. And this can be sometimes challenging, because you may know things that you feel the whole congregation needs to know. And I would reiterate something that Kay mentioned just moments ago, that the research actually shows that people give out of two fundamental reasons: compassion and community. Because of the compassion, the good works they see the congregation performing internally and in the world, and because of the community they experience there. Sometimes we as leaders know a lot, and we may give because we know of urgent need, but that is less inspiring to the majority of the congregation. So a positive approach and a kind of general it's doable, and we can do it together, and here's what we could accomplish if we could increase funding by 10%, so that you're casting a vision the entire time that you're speaking about the annual campaign.
Focusing on a program budget, we know that you can visualize the cost of your ministries rather than the electric bill. So I'll have a pie chart in just a sec here to show you. But it's really a way to figure out where your financial resources are being spent on your mission priorities, rather than saying, we are going to pay for salaries and utilities and mortgage. Think about what the common good is. Think about your mission and vision and what your ministries are. So here's an example of a pie chart where we've divided things up into 5 areas, and you can choose your own 5 areas. These are common 5 areas that I think many churches can identify with, many UU churches. So we've got our worship and celebration at 35%, and let me just take a step back and say that these percentages are not an ideal percentage, so it's just an example. So one size does not fit all. You choose what's right for your congregation. But you have worship and celebration, you have social change, caring community, and what we mean by that is, what you're doing within your community, that's all the activities that you have together. And then you can also include even some of your outreach in that as well, depending on how you decide to divide up your pie. Lifelong spiritual growth. Some congregations call that faith development. Some people call it lifelong religious education. And then this other piece we have for 5%, we've got denominational connection. So how do you connect with other congregations in your district, in your region? Do you send people to leadership school or other types of training? Do you go to General Assembly? What kind of things does your minister or your DRE do in connection with other people in our denomination? So that's where we put those types of categories. And so when you look at this chart, think about it differently than sometimes I see pie charts where we've got the 35% purple, the 15% green, and the 20% red, all as one color, and it's salaries and benefits. Like, that's what they call that. But when we think about that, we can assign what all of our professional staff are doing with their time into these other categories. So this next chart shows you what that would look like. So, for example, for your minister, you could ask your minister, say, how much time do you spend? If you took 100% of their time, how much percentage-wise would you say that you spend on worship and celebration? And they, for example, here I have all staff in the first line category, but 30% on worship and celebration, and 25% of their time, they might say, is on lifelong spiritual growth. And again, these percentages are just an example; they're not the ideal percentage, but you can divide all of their time into these categories: 25% caring community, social change, 15% they might spend on that, and denominational connection. And so whatever your staff is, if you've got a minister and a DRE, if you have a membership coordinator, if you have a choir director, an office administrator, a building steward, whatever fits in your staff category, you ask each of them how much time they spend on each of these types of activities, and then you can put it in the category. Same with your mortgage. So you have a building, how much time, if you're dividing up how the building is used, 25% of the time it's used for your worship and celebration, and 35% of the time maybe it's used for your lifelong spiritual growth, and 20% of the time for other caring community activities, and 18% for social change, and maybe only 2% for denominational connection, because a lot of that might be happening off-site, but you might have some regional or district things there on your church campus. Utilities, again, are divided up by program category rather than being a piece of the pie chart all by themselves. So again, I've listed some percentages and just divided up the amounts. And then miscellaneous can be a lot of different things. So, it can be supplies, it can be, different, money that you pay to send people to leadership school, or all sorts of things that you can fit into that category. And so I just, rather than having, too many columns here, I grouped that into the smallest piece into that line. So here is just an example of a church with a budget of $250,000, and this is how they've divided up all of their expenses into a pie chart that has program-based categories. Because if you're asking people to give to pay the salary of somebody else, it doesn't mean they're not going to give, but why do we have that person there? Why do we have our minister? Because they're working on lifelong spiritual growth, because they help us on Sundays make a fabulous worship service, because they help us with our caring community. That's really why we're here. And so you can visualize more with your program pie chart pieces what you're accomplishing with all the financial generosity that people are giving to your congregation.
So we're just a little bit curious, and then we know that those of you on the webinar with us are probably also curious. How many of you would say that you have made a shift from focusing on needs or expense budgets to program budgets, or using a pie chart to help people understand what their generosity is funding, what they are helping to happen in the world? pop on the chat and give us a little rundown of what you do. It might be, your response might be as simple as, yes, we use program budget for fundraising for our campaign, or we've never tried that before, or you might have a question about how to develop one. I would add to Kay's excellent explanation of them that once you've done a careful analysis of your expense line item budget and divided it into a program budget, it doesn't need to be redone exhaustively each year. You would know when you've added something significantly, made a significant addition to your programming, that you would need to redo it. If you add staff, or if you build a new building, if you remortgage your property, then it would be time to redo the program budget, because you would have significant changes. But you're not making a promise that this is accurate to some small percentage. You're saying that this is the best representation we can make. So we have from Boise that they have used this model very successfully last year with a mission-based narrative budget. Fantastic, Boise. Those are the kinds of things that we are always hoping for, that we're focusing our invitations to be generous on the mission and vision of the congregation. Anybody else care to tell us what you're up to right now with regard to the ways you share your congregation's needs?
Can you identify something that's going well with your congregation that you could highlight in your next annual campaign? All right, so some options on approach for your campaign. There's lots of different ways to do it, and we'll talk a little bit about what a couple people have mentioned, that they're going to year-round stewardship. And so you can have an overall monetary goal, but with programs as the focus. So depending on how your congregation goes about it, there's usually a fair bit of discussion either at the budget committee level or the finance committee or the operations team, depending on what governance model you use, about what the goal should be. You know, what kind of funding do you need to accomplish what you want to accomplish with your programs? So you can have your goal, if it's 250,000 or 500,000 or whatever number adds up, but focus on what the programs are that you're going to accomplish with those funds. Another way of doing it is to have people get on the Fair Share Giving Guide. Or to move up a level on the guide if they're already on the guide. And I'll have a picture of the guide in a moment. It's been updated recently in the last year to, we hope, be a little more user-friendly. And we have links for you so you can download that new version, both in a Word format so you can change it up a little if you like, or use the one that's there. But sometimes people ask, we're always asking, sort of for the same kind of same sort of approach. What can we do that'll be a little bit different? So if you have a goal of getting everyone on the Fair Share Giving Guide, not everybody's going to be able to get on the guide in the first year, but you could ask them to have a plan to get on the guide. And then if you're already on the guide, to move up a level on the guide. And again, I'll have a photograph of that in a minute in the slide. You could also ask for a percentage increase, but again, if you're going to do that, focus on what you can accomplish with that increase. Sometimes the increase is a compelling thing for congregations because they think, well, what does that mean for me? Everybody gives at a different level, given their economic circumstances. So if I'm giving, $1,000 and they need a certain percentage increase, what does that mean for me? How do I calculate that amount? But more importantly, what is that percentage increase going to accomplish? So that's another way that you can market what you want to accomplish with increased giving. And then having a gifts table, not everybody has one of these in their pictures. Having people see what kind of gifts that you need to accomplish your goal. So people sometimes have a good idea of what it takes really to get to the goal. And the gifts table will have, fewer gifts at the top in the top giving levels and more gifts at the bottom. And that's the way that the economic spectrum works in our congregations. But having a gifts table is an important way for people to see, wow, I didn't know we had people who are, giving $12,000, or I didn't know that we had someone that giving 8, and maybe I can step up my gift a little bit. And the gifts table can, not only does it have several ranges of giving, but it can actually have 2 columns. It can have what the giving is in ranges for currently for your program budget, and then what that next column needs to look like if you're going to fund next year's budget. And again, focusing on what you can accomplish with whatever the increase is, people can see, oh, here I am on the table. Gee, they need somebody else in the category right above. So having a gifts table is another way to approach the marketing of your annual campaign. So here, this fair share community giving is this concept that is acknowledging that you've got a broad range of financial commitments. And sometimes I go to congregations and they say, ooh, we don't want to tell people how much they should give. But actually, it's similar to, when people say, children do like some guidance. Our congregants that are giving aren't children, but they do like some information on what the expectation is about what they can give. So this guideline, this fair share guideline, and you'll see from the chart, it's a broad range from 2% to 10%. And then there's a lot of categories in between. It's acknowledging that somebody who's giving at the top left of the chart and the bottom right of the chart, they're both being equally generous within their financial means. So don't be afraid to use the guide, and don't be afraid to have a checkbox on your pledge form that says, yes, this is a fair share pledge, or you can have a box underneath that that says, yes, I have a commitment to get on the fair share giving guide. So having people check that box, people like to check that box, and having that on there, don't be shy about putting that on there or by talking about the guide. So again, a cornerstone of this guide is this economic justice piece, where we know that not everybody has the same financial resources. We know that financial circumstances differ. So be straightforward about the guide, be compassionate about the guide. If you're visiting with someone or you're describing the guide, if it's in materials that you're giving to someone, you can say, this is a guideline. If we were able to get everyone in our congregation on the Fair Share Giving Guide, we could really fund everything that we hope for and more. So again, it is a compassionate guide because it does recognize the economic diversity that's within our congregation. So here's a version of the chart that looks at what your monthly income is and your annual income, and then a percent of that. And again, as I mentioned before, it starts up here on the left at 2% and goes down to 10% in the lower right. So, and it's got 4 levels here. It has a supporter, sustainer, visionary, and transformer. So again, if people aren't on the guide, and when I've done some stewardship visits in my own congregation, people said, gee, I didn't really know what the expectation is. We're going to get on the guide this year. It'll take us a couple years, but we're going to work towards that. And then other people say, well, I'm at the sustainer level, but I really feel like that I really believe in what we're accomplishing and what the increases are going to accomplish for us. So let's move up. I'm going to move up to the visionary level. So again, there's a link there that you can copy and paste when the webinar is made available afterwards to get this chart. And you can either get it in PDF form or as a Word document. And then there's an explanatory part, another page. So it's 2 pages, the chart's on 1 page, and then they have explanation on another page.
I have a great story about this, Kay, that I'll just share really briefly. Over the years, I've done a lot of canvasser training, primarily when congregations were doing either small group model or one-on-ones, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And I did something like this and the giving chart that I've said I'll send to each of you. And a young woman, a young professional, she was probably 32 or 3, looked at some of this material, and she was a combination of angry and embarrassed, and she kind of clarified the information. She said, you mean you're telling me that with my income level and this was a few years ago, I should be giving the congregation $1,200 a year. And I said, well, you're looking at the chart. You would know better where you fall there. And she said, no, I'm telling you that. And I was canvassed for 3 years that I've been a member, and I've been giving $200 a year because no one ever told me. I could have given $200 a month without any trouble at all. I simply did not know. And I think sometimes when we are deeply engaged in the financial awareness of our congregation, we really don't recognize how uninformed of the complexity and the need of the congregation in order to fulfill its mission. Most people are actually pleased to have some guidance. They want to do the right thing. And without some guidance, they're at risk of, making too small a gift and not understanding. There's a funny proclivity in the United States that somehow churches are funded from, I think, on high, which is especially funny for Unitarian Universalist congregations, but they seem to have the same kind of bias, that there isn't some other source of income for churches other than their members. And so just being really clear about that in a completely, transparent way that is not shaming or blaming, but inviting folks. So she began giving over $1,200 a year and continued it for the entire time that I knew her in that congregation. There's also another very funny story I'll tell even more briefly. There's an older gentleman who in a congregational meeting said something about how he was the largest donor in the congregation and he intended to be heard. And somebody said to him, well, Bob, you're actually not the largest giver in the congregation, but everybody can be heard. And he said, I'm not? What's the largest gift in this congregation? And they gave him a number, and he whipped out a checkbook and he wrote a check larger than that. And he continued to do that in order to be the largest giver in that congregation. But nobody had told him that $500 was no longer the largest contribution in the congregation. So there's just story upon story about how sharing more information is generally helpful. It just generally helps people be able to do the right thing.
No, absolutely, and those are great stories, Nancy. And to tie all of this back into what we talked about a little bit earlier this evening, people's willingness to get on the guide, not only is it related to, gee, I actually didn't know about this guide, I didn't really know what the expectation was, but it's really tied also to their connection to the community and their involvement in the congregation's programs, and also, of course, to the UU values. But again, the connection and community piece is an important part of all of this, that then people feel more willing to get on the guide. They want to be part of the community, and this is one piece of that.
Right. And Kay, there's a question in the chat about the definition of adjusted income. I imagine that that's on the
Yes.
explanation page, but perhaps you could simply give it to us orally.
I don't actually have it up right here,
Okay.
but it is explained very well in the guide. It's 2 pages, and they talk about adjusted income. Now, I will say that there's a variance. Sometimes congregations decide they want to tweak what that definition is, but sometimes it's you can subtract out medical expenses or elder care or other types of things when you're doing adjusted income, and they talk about what the various categories are on the handout. So again, it's the second page of this chart that you download, but it's very clear on that. And then generally congregations use it the way it is, but sometimes people say, well, that's not the way we talk about it in our congregation, and they tweak that definition a little bit. But there are a list of things that get you to the adjusted income.
Yeah, so we were going to talk about some options for how you would communicate with members of your congregation, and certainly face-to-face personal conversations are an important component for us to keep in mind all the time. It's it's the personal reminder that you are in deep relationship with this congregation, that you will be heard, that everyone will be heard, um, and that your engagement is invited, that your support of the ministry is important. Now, often we use face-to-face to mean one-on-one, and one-on-one, every member canvas, it used to be called one-on-one personal conversations. But our second method, which is cottage meetings or small group conversations, are also very face-to-face. It's just that there would be one or two people empowered and trained to run a cottage meeting about the annual campaign, and to be sharing the good work of the congregation and the ways in which it's a worthy organization and the accomplishments towards the mission with a small group of people. 8 to 12 would be ideal. But this would also be face-to-face, and at the end of that meeting, there's a goal of completing pledge commitment cards following that meeting. There's also a possibility of doing a celebration Sunday. And a celebration Sunday is sometimes, and this can be very effective, used in a cycle of differing methodologies. But we want everyone to be very aware that a truly successful celebration Sunday has every bit as much work as whatever you're planning for this year, and all of that has to happen before the appointed Sunday in order for the celebration Sunday to be most effective. So the communication must have happened, the shared appeals, a lot of work has been done, and a lot of communication has been done prior to celebration Sunday for that to be an effective method. And when it's effective, you know, it's a pretty big high on a particular Sunday to have everybody in the congregation making their commitments at the same time, kind of reinforcing one another in their support of the mission. This last one I'd like for you to seriously consider. Obviously, it's the most ambiguous, but a mixture with a rotation schedule is what we think works best. That doing the same thing over and over becomes boring. People kind of get bored with it, don't have anything to say, or they become a little more resistant to a model that they've done many times before. So you might consider a rotation and do an every face-to-face one-on-one every 3 or 4 years. Do the cottage meetings in the alternative years, and a celebration Sunday every 3rd year or something like that. For larger congregations, though, I would like to seriously invite you to consider what I call a segmented canvas, which means that you would be doing face-to-face one-on-ones with those people who need that this year, that you might do cottage meetings with all of your new members who have never gone through this process before and frequently just don't quite get it. And so they need a different kind of information. They need an opportunity to ask their questions, and they need to be able to do that in fellowship with others who are new and don't quite understand how this all works. I have another story that's just kind of touching about pledging, and there was a congregation in the East that I worked with, and they kept getting these large envelopes with a check in it each month from a particular family, and they were very generous. And the family intended to support the church generously, but they had not understood that making a pledge meant that it would be paid over the year, and they could only pay monthly. But they were making a very generous contribution monthly. So this notion of pledging, many of us have lived inside this particular organizational structure called church and Unitarian Universalism, but so many of our new members come to us unchurched and don't understand this particular model. So you might do what I call a segmented canvas, where you have new members treated the way they need to be treated. Large donors maybe get a face-to-face every 2nd or 3rd year. Others get a cottage meeting around parents of children in religious education who might have a lot in common. And if you have new program in that area, That would be a wonderful group to have cottage meetings with in a particular year when that had a new mission focus. So you have to know who your people are, and you have to have a lot of solid information in order to do a mixture of these methodologies. But when you treat people the way they need to be treated, generosity, that is generous. You see who they are, you recognize how they need to be addressed, treated, and informed around the annual campaign. You provide that, and they respond. So the personal stewardship conversation, Kay said that I would get to this. I have kind of always enjoyed, for, I don't know, probably perverse reasons, thinking about how to talk to people faithfully, relationally, about stewardship and about their financial support of the mission of the congregation. So we set an appointment. This isn't a thing that we drop in on people to say, and so you set an appointment for coffee at their home if they are willing, though we find fewer people are as comfortable with that as they were, say, 20 years ago. And if you know them, then this second step is a kind of catch up. But if you are if you haven't met them and don't know them well, an opportunity to get acquainted with one another around your shared commitments to the community, the mission of the church, the different programs. Perhaps you both sing in the choir, finding those connections. And then an opportunity to share what's been meaningful to you, to ask what's been meaningful to them, to listen carefully in that sense. And then if you are willing, what is most effective, I promise you, is to share what your personal commitment is this year and to ask them to join you. So you might do that by sharing a percentage increase. So my husband and I have been talking about this, and we've decided this is the year that we will increase our support of the congregation by 10%, and I want to ask you if you will join us. Or we are going to double our pledge because this new assistant minister and the capacity that he or she will provide is so important to the fulfillment of the mission. Will you consider doubling your pledge? If you are comfortable or think that the person you're speaking to is comfortable, you can actually speak dollars. I find that people are a little bit more comfortable sharing the percentage increases than they are the dollar increases, but it is your information, and if you are willing to share it in an invitation, a transparent sharing of information, and an invitation to invite someone to be as generous as you are, it's yours to share, and that is perfectly all right. And then the end of a personal stewardship conversation is the completion of the financial commitment form. I would say if you're talking to new members, the other thing that's important about the pledge form or the commitment form is to help them understand that this commitment allows us to plan for the year. It allows us to have confidence that you will honor that commitment, and therefore we can plan our our level of staffing, our level of programming throughout the year because we're confident of your support. And then I wonder about your reflections on different campaign methods. Have you been doing face-to-face regularly or in the last couple of years? On what schedule do you do it? How did it go? How is it received by your congregation? I know some of you have been speaking about approaching capital campaigns also. So Boise, I think, might be retiring a mortgage and those kinds of things. Are you doing those face-to-face? So if you would just pop a little bit of information for us into the chat box, we'd love to know where things stand and what is most popular, or if you care to add just a little statement about why you've chosen to do whatever model you've chosen to do.
So certainly Celebration Sunday is one of the ways to do it, and often, again, that can be an efficient way. You can get 70% or more sometimes of all the pledges turned in just on that one day. There's a fair bit of prep, as Nancy mentioned earlier, in doing that, but it is a great model. Get together all together in one place and celebrate, and have everybody walk up and put their pledge form in a big basket at the front, or you can pass the pledge cards around the table if you're doing it at a meal. But certainly that's one of the models to do, and again, rotating the type of way that you do the annual budget drive is an important thing, and that's one of the effective ways to do it. There is a fair bit of cleanup, if you will, a follow-up, because not everyone will attend that event, or not everyone will be able to fill out their pledge cards that day. All right, so why don't we move on to timing for annual campaign. And I just wanted to, just because it's fairly up in the chat box, just very quickly, I know someone mentioned early on about the three-legged stool there, where you've got your estates, your capital, and your annual giving, and those do usually come from three different pools. Since several of you are doing your capital campaigns coming up, usually people are giving from assets for a capital campaign over a 3-year period, sometimes as long as 5. And then for annual campaigns, usually that's coming from income, and then for estate giving, that's usually coming, from the estate after you are have passed on to the next spiritual plane. So usually those are coming from 3 kind of different pools, 3 different types of areas when you're funding those 3 things. All right, so timing for your annual campaign. It's great to begin planning 5 to 6 months before your launch. Who's going to be on the team? What role are they going to serve? You want to really ramp up your publicity at least 2 months prior to the launch, so people know that it's coming up. If you have an event, you want to make sure people save the date. And launching a campaign, having your stewardship moments in the month prior to the launch is great. I know some people like to have stewardship moments during the campaign as well. That can be great. If you have a quiet phase or a leadership gifts phase, then it's great for those folks and all your visiting stewards, if you're doing that model, who are pledging in advance, to hear some of the stewardship moments before they pledge, since those are effective. And some of you mentioned that you've gone to a year-round stewardship model, or that you are planning on doing that. So actually having a stewardship moment every month is great. Even when you're not leading up to a campaign. And when we talk about what that stewardship moment is, it can be a skit or a song, rather than just a testimonial of why the church is important. You can convey your message in a lot of ways. I was part of one recently where we did a fun little rhyme where we were advertising a financial feasibility study, and we wanted people to pay attention and be generous in their response to participate when they got a letter asking for that. So there's lots of different ways to do it to make it fun, and so these stewardship moments prior to the launch are very important, but doing those year-round are great. So have a public launch and a close, no matter which method you use, whether it's cottage meetings, face-to-face meetings, or Celebration Sunday, or a mix. And then have it be really about 3 weeks long, maximum 1 month. I've seen some things that talk about 6 to 8 weeks. That's really a long time for it to drag on. It's long for the campaign team. It's long for the congregation. When you think about getting something in the mail and it's not due for 6 weeks, you tend to set it aside. So having it be a shorter time frame is better. And then you have a short cleanup period of a couple of weeks where you're making calls, writing letters, depending on the demographic and who you're sending that to. And then not having any other fundraisers, congregational meetings, or votes on critical issues during an annual campaign is just an important thing to remember. You'd like people to focus on funding the programs, and so although some of the other things might help that, and fundraisers, having those happen at a different time than the annual campaign is great. So recruiting diverse talent is also important. So we know that when you're putting together a team for an annual budget drive, sometimes people run the other way when you ask them to be on that. But a good way to recruit is to have a particular task in mind for that person that you can define for them. And so if you want somebody to help plan the launch party or host something in their home, That doesn't mean we have to talk about money. It just means you'd love to have them help with their excellent skills that they have in planning the event, for example, or their warm hospitality that they offer when you've been to their home for something else. So have a specific thing. You can have a graphic designer who is fabulous with graphic design, and again, targeting your request so you have a wide variety of people on your team, not just the people who are willing to talk about money or be a visiting steward. Have it be broad. Detail-oriented people, I always love. I have one particular gentleman in our congregation who's my go-to person to find the typo or find the alternate interpretation of the text. He's wonderful. I love to have him read my thing, so I'm always having him on a team for something. Getting creative people who have great ideas. I'm working with somebody now who, at my own congregation, who's got this whole game show idea, and she's very creative, and it's wonderful to have her be part of it. And then make sure that you don't forget to loop in the minister and the professional staff. So, are they going to be around to have either the Sermon on the Amount or the generosity sermon, whatever it is, at the time that your campaign is launching? How can the director of religious education loop in the congregation with what the kids are doing, having kids be part of the campaign, having them understand? Sometimes congregations have kids draw the artwork for some programmatic things or the theme for the campaign, which is a great way to loop together multi-generationally for a campaign. And so just having a wide variety of people is important. And again, when recruiting your team, emphasize the care and connection rather than the money, because if you do the care and connection piece right, the money part will flow in, and you'll be able to take care of things. So infusing community into your individual meetings is an important piece. So I have a list of things, and I'll go a little bit quickly through this so that we can make sure that we're able to wrap up on time. So having a meeting, many of you probably have read Eric Walker Wickstrom's book that talks about lay leadership as a spiritual practice, and he has a section in there where he's talking about how to run a good committee meeting. It doesn't have to be a stewardship meeting, it could be any kind of a meeting, but you want to make it spiritual if you can. Begin with a reading and a channel sliding. You can rotate who's got the reading for each meeting. You can ask for input on agendas beforehand, and then listen attentively and generously. It doesn't mean you need to let one committee member go on for 10 minutes. You can have a talking stick if you need that. But also give people an opportunity for feedback on the process at the end. And close with an expression of gratitude, because everyone's giving their time, and let them know how much you appreciate that. And then get together at least once without any team business. If you've got a team that's been working on something, have a potluck at somebody's house where you don't discuss anything about what the committee work you've been doing together. You don't talk about that at all. You're just communing together and appreciating each other and getting to know each other better, or talking about, all sorts of things. So, all right. And think about too, some of your deepest relationships at church can be formed during these committee meetings. So think about what the tone of the meeting is, and again, try and infuse the community in there.
So being inclusive in your planning, we mostly want to be sure that you're recognizing that the whole congregation is in this with you. You've accepted a particular level of responsibility for which we are grateful and they are grateful, but a lot of other people can be helpful if they know how to do that. So being as open and careful about your planning as you can so that staff can be helpful. This might mean that your children and youth's Sunday programming on your launch day is about generosity, or that their programming thinks about mission and vision and reinforces all of your work too. Planning the scope of the work and the timing needed for your administrative staff to be supportive around the development of all the materials, and that they look they look beautiful the way you want them to. And then, the capacity to do this advanced planning it does minimize conflict, and it also allows you to amplify the number of people who are sharing your message and supporting your work, are kind of all on board for this particular campaign.
So we know that one size doesn't fit all for a lot of things, and we want to make giving easy. So I've listed some ways here that you can have your congregants give, and many of you may use these methods. You can have your electronic funds transfer. So Vanco is one of the ways that one of the services that a lot of churches use, where you can give a voided check and you say, I want to give this much per month. And then the church initiates that transaction on their end. The benefit of that is it helps with regular cash flow. And so you're not relying on someone to come to church and put a check in the plate to meet their pledge. And of course, you can stop that process at any time, so you can reassure people, if they're not familiar with that process, that it's not set in stone, that they can just make a call and you can change that. A lot of people are opting for that these days. They'd like to make things easy. They do a lot of online bill pay, and people can, of course, initiate a monthly check automatically from their own end as well. But this Vanco offering or some other service like that is a good way to go. Checks is, of course, a way that we certainly accept giving. Cash as well. And if you want to make sure that gets credited to a particular person, you can have envelopes available in your giving baskets if you want to do that. Credit cards are becoming an increasingly popular option about how people want to give. There are ways that you can set the credit card transaction up so that the transaction fee becomes an additional donation by the donor, so that you're not losing money on that transaction, if you will. And then even more recently, you're seeing QR codes and kiosks and squares. So sometimes congregations are even having a kiosk or even a cash station that's in the lobby of their congregation, so people can come in and give, make their payment that way. And the QR code is something that many of you probably know you can scan on your with your phone, and then it brings up a screen so that you can get information that way. So you want to have a variety of options, including online giving, allowing people to do it in the mail, in-person giving. Try and cover all the bases. Again, one size does not fit all. Some people really, it's meaningful to them to put cash or a check in the plate on Sunday as a spiritual practice, and other people would prefer to just have it go electronically and they don't have to think about it. So stock is a great way to give money, because you don't pay capital gains tax. And on the pledge forms for many congregations, including my own, we do have stock as an option for giving. There's also, you can give directly from an IRA, and if you're 71 years and older, then that automatic required distribution from your IRA doesn't count towards your income. So that's another way to give that's often appealing to people. So just a quick reflection, what options for payment does your congregation offer? And if you use an automatic payment through Vanco, does this impact your cash flow?
Part of integrating a generosity in all things throughout your congregational life means that you would really want to offer a celebration after the campaign. And I would say to you that in large part, all campaigns are successful. And so if you have many measures of success, that's more likely to be the case. And if you've emphasized that there are many paths to success for your stewardship campaign, as well as the financial amount that you've raised, and recognize in your committee and in your larger leadership. I've had basically a pastoral call with a congregation who had increased their giving by 21%, but fallen $4,000 short of an amazing goal. So clearly they had done a wonderful job. And some felt that it was a failure, and some felt it was an amazing success. And so we don't want to set anyone up to think that all of their work was a failure. And one way to kind of mediate against that is to have a number of different ways that you are measuring how the congregation is responding to the mission and vision which is being offered. So Kay has just run a number of different ways that you can look at this. Another one, yes, number of new pledges. And sometimes those new pledges are not from new members. So one of the things that our committees sometimes don't give very much time to is the number of zero pledging members or zero pledging close friends. And so the opportunity to convert some of those to generous support of the mission is another serious form of success. And then to celebrate the volunteers and the time and effort they've given in order to make it possible for your congregation to continue to fulfill its mission, and emphasizing all that you can accomplish with these funds moving forward.
Ask what's possible, not what's wrong. Invite in everybody who cares to work on what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone is an expert about something. Know that creative solutions come from new connections. Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people closer together. Trust that meaningful conversations can change your world. And that's from Turning to One Another by Meg Wheatley.